Hello, Garland Nixon here with the one and only Scott Ritter. And Tucker Carlson has made some comments lately that were very interesting, and I think we need to discuss them. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with the one and only Scott Ritter. And first of all, what's important to know is if you want to find out what's happening with Scott Ritter, you can go to scottritter.com. That's scottritter.com to find out everything he's working on, find out his projects. He's got the Russia House. He's got a new book coming out we're about to talk about. Let me just say real quick before we get started, a little teaser of what we're going to be talking about today. And Tucker Carlson has recently talked about how close we were to nuclear war. He's talked about under the Biden administration, how reckless they were. He talked about how the issue of the U.S. losing a war to Russia. We're going to talk about all that today. But first, Scott Ritter, you got a new book out. What's happening?
Hey, good morning, Garland.
Good morning.
Yep, name of the book is Highway to Hell, the Armageddon Chronicles, 2015, 2024. This book was something that I was planning on writing. As Garland knows, last fall I was very aggressively trying to warn people about the dangers of nuclear war and how dangerous the Biden administration's policies were. I think history will show that in September and again in November, we came closer to actual nuclear conflict with Russia than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And some people, including myself, believe that it was even more. We were at greater risk. And so I wanted to get a book out that touched on this issue, that laid out in stark detail the nature of the threat. While I was working on this book, I got visited by the FBI. Who kicked down my door, seized my computers, and on that computer was a draft of this book, and a draft of another book, and drafts of articles, which they took, and they have not returned them. So, like any writer confronted with losing the product of his or her work, you dread the concept of starting over. I mean, because you've already committed something to writing, and it's hard to recapture that. But then I started also reflecting on what the government was doing. They were accusing me of being a Russian agent. They were saying that I was working on behalf of Russia, and they were pointing to the contributor contributor status I had with both RT and Sputnik, and saying this was the evidence. And I went and looked at some of the articles that I wrote for RT and Sputnik, especially on the nuclear threat, because I had used them. I had assembled all of my previous writing to use as a foundation upon which to write this book. And I said, there's no difference. If I erased RT and put Huffington Post, which has published my work, or I've put Truthdig, or I put the American Conservative, or the Washington Spectator, or Consortium News, there's no difference, none whatsoever. So I decided that rather than reworking these articles, I would put them together as a library of the work I've done over the past decade, trying to warn the American public and the world about the threat of nuclear weapons and the importance of arms control. And so what this is the Armageddon Chronicles. I have collected articles that I've written over the course of the past decade, put them together chronologically, linked them topically to create a narrative of the danger. And it's not just about the threat of nuclear war. It's also an expression of free speech, because I want to point out that the U.S. government didn't want me to write this book. They seized my damn computer. They didn't return it. They know there's nothing on that computer, but they refused to return it to date. And they tried to discredit me, to paint me as a Russian agent, so that people wouldn't listen to what I was trying to say. So this book is also a defense of free speech because I put side by side articles written for RT and articles written for the American Conservative, which no one could call a Russian outlet. And so people can see that the content is the same. The analysis is the same. The facts are the same. There's no difference here. The notion that articulating against nuclear war and in favor of arms control is a Kremlin talking point is stupidity personified. But that, again, sort of defines the approach of the United States government when it comes to nuclear disarmament. And here we have the Trump administration saying the right things about wanting arms control. But the fact is, we're less than a year away from losing the last arms control treaty, New START. And I discussed this in this book. And what happens when this treaty expires? We're into a new nuclear arms race. And unless we repair relations with Russia, this could lead to a very real threat of nuclear war. So this book is timely. It's a defense of free speech, and it's meant to empower people with knowledge and information about the dangers of nuclear war and the importance of arms control.
Well, let me just tell you, just before we go forward, one of the things I did on my Substack today, I went on Grok, which is Elon Musk's own AI bot, and I searched, why is Garland Nixon not on X? Just as an example, Nixon's outspoken commentary, often on controversial geopolitical topics, may have triggered these actions. This is Grok. This is the system's own thing. It says where are we? Historically, Nixon, a journalist and radio host known for his progressive and anti-imperialist views, has faced restrictions on X for content that appears to violate platform rules. So bottom line is, we know the game here, Scott, and it was never about what you were saying violating any rules. It was about they didn't want to hear it, and so they reinterpreted it. I'll put it like this. I will guarantee if you or I, either one, landed in a Heathrow or Berlin or something like that, boy, before we got off the plane, they'd have a room waiting for us on the side for us to be dragged and beaten and thrown back on the plane and sent back to wherever if we were lucky. Anyway, let's get to this. And I think this is critical. There may be some people that don't know. One of the things that Scott pushed, created, and a lot of people worked with was this Say No to Nuclear War. So before we get to this, update people on that Say No to Nuclear War project that you did and what you think about it in the fall.
Well, we started with Say No to Nuclear War, and people might remember I called it Operation Dawn because it was linked to the election. And I was asking people, what would you do to save democracy, to save America, to save the world through your vote in November? Because I was trying to tell people that there's only one issue at stake here, and that's the survival of humanity. And the candidate that best articulates a stance against nuclear war should be the candidate that gets your vote. Everything else literally doesn't matter. And to back this up, we had a number of events. We had the Kingstown event in Kingstown in New York, Gerald Celante's Say No to War event, where I introduced Operation Dawn. We had a panel discussion in New York City in November, where we talked about the danger of nuclear war and how to mobilize people. And then after the election, we had a sort of a post mortem, so to speak, on, okay, Trump is elected. Now, what do we do to stop a nuclear war? And so we had another one at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in December. That one actually, they all, just so people know that from September came an article co-authored by RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr., published in The Hill, which alone of any candidate, Trump said, we have to avoid nuclear war. And the way to do this is to come, find a way for peace with Russia. That's what we were asking for. And I can say that article happened I can honestly say that article happened because of the work we did. In November, we sought to mobilize. Whether or not that had an impact on votes, I don't know. What we do know is the candidate that I put my thumb on, the only guy who articulated against nuclear war, won the election. But then we said that's not enough. You have to hold people accountable for what they do in their name. And in December, we met saying that it's imperative that pressure be put on the Biden administration to stop advocating the use of American missiles to strike targets deep inside Russia, because this violates Russia's nuclear doctrine, and we will go to war. Russia will use nukes in retaliation. And it was also important to get the Trump campaign to commit to this. Within a week, Trump was saying, yeah, we have to stop this policy. So guys, anybody who says that advocacy work like this doesn't work, it works. I'm not saying that we alone, but we were part of a process that took America away from almost having a nuclear war with Russia to, today we're talking about bettering relations with Russia and avoiding World War III. But it's not over yet. We have to talk about disarmament. It's a very important component. Donald Trump has said that he's in favor of it, but he doesn't have a disarmament czar. They're not moving forward. Maybe that'll be part of future things, but we have to keep the feet to the fire. One of the things we did in December is we brought in Theodore Postal, and he did this very compelling presentation where he showed what happens when a nuclear weapon hits Washington, D.C. And Dennis Kucinich spoke powerfully, Lawrence Wilkerson, Garland did, others. And one of the ideas was to take that on the road. That's very expensive and very time consuming. But we are working on doing a pilot project in Boston to nail it down, and then to go to Hawaii. Now, people say, well, Scott, you just want to go to Hawaii. Well, you ain't lying.
Yeah.
That's not why. I hope the American people understand there's only one place in America where people have run to nuclear bomb shelters fearing the imminent danger of a nuclear weapons strike. There's Americans today that thought they were going to die because they were told by their government that our nuclear armed missile is inbound. And all life stopped in Hawaii as they ran to shelters, and there were people outside going, there isn't a shelter. And they were looking at the sky saying, my God, I'm going to die. Theodore Postal's bomb is going to blow up, and it's going to come in and consume me in hellfire. And that's Hawaii. And so what we're going to do is go to Hawaii. I'm going to try and get Theodore Postal to do his simulation of what happens if a nuclear weapon hits Oahu, which is, home to Pearl Harbor, Hickam Air Force Base, Pacific Command, and other things, and then interview the people that were running and capture this and create a documentary that we can then, instead of us going from city to city to city as a group, send that documentary maybe with one or two people to go play the documentary, show people the danger of this and the importance of arms control, and to try and inject this into the national discourse. So that's what we're doing. Operation Dawn ain't dead.
Well, and let me say this, because I've heard people say, well, yeah, but Trump's going to start a war with China and then we'll get a nuke the same. Here's what I have to say. If there's a bear in front of you that's about to eat you, and you're like, oh my God, we gotta hide in a cave and get a spear and stop the bear from eating us. And someone else says, yeah, why bother with that? There's a dragon around the corner. Fair enough. But if I get eaten by the bear, the dragon won't be relevant. So I have to fight the bear first. And I'm not saying fight Russia. I'm saying symbolically, there is something that's an existential threat to me right now. We're going to do something with Russia and we're going to die. We got to stop that. And then next, there's something with China we got getting. Okay, fair enough. We got to get on that next. But let's try not to. You can't act on the next threat if you're dead by the first threat. Not only that, I will add one other thing, Scott. Yeah. If you build a coalition of people to fight, quote, nuclear war, right, against this particular possibility, whereas you don't even have to wait. If we get this one subsided, you can immediately begin saying, okay, let's fight that nuclear war, period. And let's push our elected officials. God knows we don't want to start me with how bad I hate these bastards, all of them. But let's push our elected officials now to move for some new kinds of treaties. You know what I mean? It's about building something, but you got to address the threat in front of you before you can go to the next threat. And addressing the threat in front of you allows you to build some kind of a coalition for future threats.
You've seen a grizzly bear, full-grown grizzly bear. And you've seen where they take a paw of a human being and the paw of the bear. Okay, the Russian bear is a full-grown grizzly bear with the claws, and I mean, we got to handle that. Not kill it, but learn to live in peace with this bear. It's a reality.
Yep.
The dragon that everybody talks about, you've seen Game of Thrones, right? All right. I mean, Daenerys had dragons. Now, what they're implying is that this is the big ass dragon that flew at the end of the movie, burning the entire city, King's Landing down to a ground. No, this is the dragon, like in season 2, the tiny little dragon that threw out a little bit of flame, could burn a person, maybe burn a couple people, but it ain't destroying a city. The Chinese nuclear arsenal today numbers in hundreds of nuclear weapons that are on a handful of missiles. They're increasing it. But the Chinese have said, we're not interested in arms control until the United States and Russia sort of figure out what they're doing.
They're the big boys. They're the big boys.
Once they figure out what they're doing, then we'll figure out where we fit in this. But if the United States and Russia are talking about blowing off caps to nuclear weapons in a new nuclear arms race, we ain't waiting. We're starting so that we already have momentum. So the Chinese right now are digging hundreds of missile silos, building scores of DF-41 solid rocket multiple warhead carrying missiles that they can move around these silos like, I don't know there's a term there. You have a whole bunch of stuff and you move it around. It's like, I don't know, battleship or something. But the point is that the Chinese, it's a small dragon though. We don't need to be sitting there going, oh, no, we got to worry about China. No. We got to worry about Russia. Russia and America have a treaty that is foundational in nature. And if we can resume this treaty, and it's the easiest thing in the world to do, resume this treaty, give it a 5-year life extension. What you've done there is you continue to keep that cap of 1,550. You then open the door for the more difficult negotiations on how we incorporate new weaponry and how we bring things even further. And you open the door to say, hey, China, why don't you come here and sit down at the table with us and join in this conversation? So that the
maybe Pakistan, maybe India, you know what I mean? Once you get that with Russia, maybe you start working with other.
You get to where you need, but I'm just talking about making sure that the dragon that we're dealing with is an adolescent dragon, not a fully grown dragon. That's all. Yeah. I don't want the big ass dragon that's burning down the city. I want the little dragon that's burning the slave owner.
Exactly. If Russia and the U.S. go in, it's over for everybody. We don't need, Anyway, okay. So and this is important because something that just isn't being discussed as we talk about that. This is part of a gigantic danger, and I'm glad that Tucker Carlson is saying it, right? American policymakers are too arrogant to acknowledge that they have lost a war with Russia over Ukraine. U.S. journalist Tucker Carlson has said, right? Russian officials perceive that it's a NATO. We already know it's a proxy war. Everybody said it. So in an interview with Alex Jones, he said, we just lost a war with Russia. The U.S. was running that war. The U.S., the military, the Pentagon, State Department, CIA. It was never about Ukraine. Nobody will say that out loud, that we're overstating our power. He likened the U.S. to a divorced 60-year-old man attempting to woo a 25-year-old woman, oblivious to how absurd and humiliating he appears. So here's the bottom line, Scott. And I mean, it's something, the danger ain't over because they haven't admitted. Now, don't get me wrong. It's like a chess game. You can get to a point in chess or checkers or whatever, where you look up and you're like, oh, crap. And everybody on both sides knows this game's over. If I make another move, you're going to make that move and I'm going to lose. If I make this move, there's no scenario which I don't lose. It's checkmate. We just haven't called it that yet. And that's where we are. But it's dangerous because at some point the rubber meets the road and everybody looks and goes, and all of these people that have been told for the last umpteen X amount of years, Russia's weak, Ukraine's winning, we need to keep this going so the Ukraine can hold off and blah, blah, blah. And at some point, everybody's going to look at the leaders and say, hey, It told us that Russia couldn't win. Ukraine's collapse. You know what I'm saying? God knows the crazies in Ukraine could say, hey, we'll just blow up a nuclear power plant since we lost. We're going to come to that point. And it's critical that we start having a discussion about the truth about it. And I'm glad to hear Tucker Carlson do that. Your thoughts, Scott?
Yeah, Tucker's speaking fact. First of all, let's start with statements of fact. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is a proxy war. It's a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is the proxy. Not Scott Ritter saying that. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States of America. He said, now I've said it earlier. In fact, I was put on a Ukrainian death list for daring to say that there was a proxy conflict back in 2022. And I was, that's a Kremlin talking point. Scott Ritter's a Russian agent. New York Times just published an article that basically articulated everything that I said as fact, that we were running this war from the very beginning. This was a proxy conflict from the very beginning. Now, the whole goal in this proxy conflict was to create a scenario that sort of fulfilled the vision set forth by George Soros in a 1993 article where he talked about the future of the world in a post-Soviet environment. And he said that the West will always need Russia as a threat, always need Russia as a threat. But the problem is, if you articulate Russia as a threat and the only solution you have is NATO armies or American armies, then the body bags become a problem. You see, then the body bags come home and nobody wants the war where American and NATO body bags are coming home. So he said the solution is for NATO to develop a source of Eastern European manpower that is then empowered with Western technology to fight the Russians so that when the body bags come home, they're Eastern European body bags. And that's exactly what Ukraine is. This is something that's been long in planning, ladies and gentlemen. This didn't just happen out of the blue. And when I've been saying and others have been saying that Russia didn't start this war, they didn't. This is a war that's been in the planning stage for a long time now by the West. It's a war of the collective West against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy. The other thing we need to realize is that Ukraine was never supposed to win. I just want people to understand that too. There was never a war-winning strategy put forward. You see that it's sort of hinted at in the New York Times article because the Ukrainians were, frustrated. We want to do this. We want to win. And everybody's going, nah, hold back. Boom. The goal was never to defeat Ukraine or to defeat Russia. The goal was for Russia to collapse through the combined effects of economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the political unrest that would accrue when the bite of sanctions brought down the standard of living, brought down the economy. The goal was to create a Moscow Maidan moment where the people of Russia rose up and took down Vladimir Putin, because that's what this is all about, ladies and gentlemen. It's about getting rid of Vladimir Putin and replacing him with a compliant Russian leader, sort of like Boris Yeltsin 2.0, that will return Russia from this status that it enjoys today of a strong, independent, self-sufficient nation to a nation dependent upon the West, compliant to the West, and oppressed by the West. That's what the decade of the 1990s was. So that's what this is all about. They didn't have a plan B because this was never supposed to be about a Ukrainian military victory. It was supposed to be about wearing Russia down. Russia won. I mean, war is an extension of politics by other means, and you can't just look at the battlefield. You look at the totality of things. Tucker Carlson is saying that Russia has won this war. I've been saying Russia has won this war. Garland's been saying Russia has won this war because Russia has won this war. They've won it militarily, but perhaps more importantly, they've won it economically. They're not suffering from these sanctions. In fact, their economy continues to grow at a robust rate. They've reconfigured their economy. I mean, it's interesting now when we talk about the return of Western companies to Russia, and the Western companies are lining up saying, we want to get back into that, $100 billion plus market. And the Russians saying, no. You see, you left and we rebuilt our economy. We now have Russian companies that have been formed that have stepped in, and they're doing what you did, and they're doing it better, and the money stays in Russia. And we're not going to screw these companies by saying, no, you come in and compete with them. So if you made the decision to leave, it's your problem, not our problem. And the Russian economy is robust right now. It doesn't need the West. This is real. Politically speaking, prior to the special military operation, Vladimir Putin was a 63% kind of guy. What I mean by that is you have a national election and Vladimir Putin wins 63% of the vote. And then you have another, 30 some odd percent that gets, goes to the Communist Party and the opposition.
Yeah, the Communist Party was the number two party, and the Communist Party people didn't like Putin. And then after you know what the biggest thing they were angry at him about? I've talked to a lot of, what the biggest thing the Communist Party was angry about him? About Ukraine. They wanted him to go in years ago. So if you think about it, the pushback that he was getting in Russia was because he wouldn't go into Ukraine earlier. That's what people won't accept. How is he going to collapse for going in Ukraine when his biggest opposition was because he wouldn't go in Ukraine? That's an important point.
But there was a problem here because, when you look at the way the domestic politics of Russia were, they're tied to the economy. James Carville's 1992 maxim that he gave to Bill Clinton in that election, it's the economy, stupid, applies globally. It's the economy, stupid. And so here you are, you're Vladimir Putin, and you have an economy that is about 20, 30% so deeply entangled in the West that you can't separate them. And Putin knows that entanglement is what the pro-Western, leaning of this entanglement is what empowers the Nemtsovs and the Navalnys and the others, the opposition that continuously gets fed resources from Western intelligence sources and non-governmental organizations to undermine Russian. And again, I just want to point out to people, they say, well, Scott, how could you say it's about undermining Russian democracy? America promotes democracy. Well, geez, A, I've been studying this topic for a long time, but B, it helps every now and then when like the number 2 man at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, who was there in 1994, Mr. Mary, I think his name was, publishes an article. Now, he wrote what's called the second long telegram. The first one was Kennan's long telegram, 46, I believe, that led to containment. Mary wrote one in the aftermath of the great defender of democracy, Boris Yeltsin, bringing tanks into the street of Moscow and firing on the Russian parliament. Hey, how democratic is that when the president literally goes to war against the parliament? And we supported this. And then we tried to cook up an election in 94, and we lost. The others got there. And so he wrote a warning. He said, we've put political and economic gain. We put economic gain ahead of doing the right thing by Russia. He said, Russia right now in a moment where we should be promoting democracy. We should be helping Russia build institutions for democracy. And instead, we're literally suppressing them because we want to keep this guy Yeltsin in power, who is a very undemocratic leader. And in 94, we cooked it. In 96, we bought an election. We bragged about it. New York, the Time magazine cover, the best election money can buy. We bought an election in Russia. That's what we did in the 1990s. We destroyed Russian democracy by not allowing it to ever develop. We backed Russian dictators. We call Putin a dictator. Boris Yeltsin was a Russian dictator backed by the United States. But his job wasn't to make Russia strong. It was to tear Russia down, to allow America in, to empower oligarchs, which is the other thing that people tend to forget about, that Russia was heavily dominated economically by, these oligarchs who went in the post, communist era and gained access to all of these state monopolies and turned them into, private monopolies. And then they made hundreds of billions of dollars that they took out of the country that didn't get fed back into Russia. Russia was a basket case. And Vladimir Putin's been fighting against that narrative, against that momentum to rebuild Russia ever since. And we don't like it. We don't like it. The Russia reset of 2008, you might remember that, where Obama, got Hillary Clinton to meet with Sergei Lavrov, and she brought in this little box with a red button, and Yeah, they're the Yanks to the rescue, the best election we could buy. And they were supposed to push it. And instead of saying reset, it said overcharged. And Lavrov went, sort of the opposite of what we want to do. But the point is, that wasn't about restoring relations. It was about regime change. The entire reset policy was about keeping Vladimir Putin out because he had 2 terms, served it constitutionally. That's all he could serve. So he did a little swap with Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev became president. Putin became prime minister. The goal was at the end of that, swap back. I'm not saying that's how democracy is supposed to work. I'm saying that's the reality of it because Putin understood that the West was trying to bring him down, bring Russia down, to tear it down. And he said, we can't let this happen. We can't be normal and step aside and let other forces come in because there is no other force. The democratic opposition that was supposed to be built naturally that Putin praised and the potential in 2004, 2005 was CIA backed for the sole purpose of bringing down the Russian government. And so they did the little swap. And what Michael McFaul advised Obama is we need to keep Medvedev in and keep Putin out. And we do this by what we call the reset. But the reset was simply to bribe Medvedev to renege on the deal of swapping back, to keep Medvedev in power and push Putin out. It got so ridiculous that in 2011, Joe Biden, who was then the vice president, flew to Moscow on the eve of these elections and had a meeting with the Russian opposition in Moscow and said, it's not going to be good for Russia or Vladimir Putin if he runs for president again. We strongly advise him not to do that. Could you imagine a Russian leader flying to America and meeting with the opposite? Let's say, the next election comes up. Dmitry Medvedev flies to America and meets with the Democratic Party and says it wouldn't be good for America or for J.D. Vance to run in. It'd be very bad for them. You think Americans would go, thank you. Did you mean? Well, maybe the Democrats might, but the point is, you don't interfere in elections this way. But that's what we did. We interfered in these elections. So this war was always about regime change, about getting rid of Vladimir Putin, and they failed. They failed. And so that means we lost the war. And now we have to live with the consequences of that. This was never about military power versus military power. This was never about NATO bringing forward its capabilities to decisively confront Russia. This was about using Ukraine as a proxy to wear Russia down. We didn't care about Ukrainian casualties. Hell, the thing was designed with the Soros vision in mind of the body bags being Eastern European, therefore they don't matter. And they don't. We can give lip service all we want. How many Americans shed tears over the 1.1 million Ukrainian soldiers that have died so far? Nobody gives a damn about them. It's a number we throw around haphazardly. Even Donald Trump claims to care about them. We don't. He's the guy that sent the javelins and the stingers to set this whole thing up in 2016. Donald Trump, we built training facilities in Western Ukraine in 2015. The U.S. Army brags about it. We're training 1 battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards every 55 days so they can go and kill Russians over in the East. And we've been doing that nonstop since 2015. Donald Trump was elected in 2016, became president in 2017, and he inherited that program, and he didn't shut it down and say, this is stupid. Why are we encouraging war with Russia? He doubled down on stupid and gave them javelins and stingers and promoted this as robust American policy. So Trump doesn't care about Ukrainian life. Nobody cares about Ukrainian life, except maybe the Russians. They may be the only power out there that actually gives a damn about the Ukrainians because this war pains them. The Ukrainians are fellow Slavs, and this is like a civil war, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. The Russians appear to be the only ones who care about Ukrainian life. Europe certainly doesn't. They want this war to continue. They're encouraging more Ukrainians. They're asking Ukraine to mobilize their 18-year-olds to finish the last genetic, base foundation upon which Ukraine could possibly rebuild. They want to slaughter them as well so that Ukraine simply disappears as a nation state. We have lost this war, and there's nothing that can be done to retrieve it. NATO as an institution is incapable of marshaling military power sufficient to take on the Russians. I just throw out a historical analogy here. In 1942, Germany continued their big offensive against Russia. They started with their offensive in their counteroffensive in Kharkov. The Russians launched a big spring offensive. The Russians absorbed it and then set their counterattack, and they drove on towards Stalingrad, then up into the Caucasus, and this was supposed to be the knockout blow. To do this, Russia needed the help of the Hungarians and the Romanians. And the Romanians mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, and the Hungarians mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops, and off they went. Big masses of army. A lot of numbers there. But when the Soviets counterattacked, they hit the Romanians and the Hungarians first. They collapsed like a house of cards because they couldn't fight. The German army could fight, but now they're in a desperate situation because the flanks have collapsed, and now they have to move back and try and cover this. So they left the 6th Army in Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army came back, was fighting this mobile action, and they barely were able to survive. They lost the 6th Army, lost the Battle of Stalingrad. The reason why I bring this up is people keep talking about NATO's numbers. Let's just say hypothetically that NATO decided to intervene with the core of American troops. So we've got big, strong, viable American army, and we're pretty damn good. We can fight in high-intensity conflict. We're trained. We have the equipment. We have the doctrine, the whole thing. And to our left are the Poles. There are hundreds of thousands of them. And to our right are the Romanians, and there's 100,000 of them. There's some French and some British scattered around there. And we start fighting the Russians. Well, first thing that's going to happen is the Poles are going to collapse like a house of cards. That's not me saying it, ladies and gentlemen. The Polish High Command came out and said, what the hell are we doing? If we go to war against Russia, we run out of ammunition in 14 days. And let me give you a pro hint. You run out of ammunition in a high-intensity conflict, you sort of lost the war. You're dead. So the Poles are gone. The Romanians don't even have 14 days worth of ammunition. They're not even going to get out. They're going to be just running around with their heads up their butts because they don't know how to do this kind of stuff, and they're gone. The French, they're dead. The British, they die valiantly, and they're all dead. And the Americans are left alone, like the 4th Panzer Army, and they'll be maneuvering around, but we don't have any receivers. See, the Germans, as the 4th Panzer got spun out, were able to mobilize divisions, pull divisions out of Sicily, pull divisions elsewhere, pour them in to stabilize the front. We don't have anything left. We don't have anything to reinforce. So as our military gets ground down, there's nothing to reinforce, and we get beat. That's the reality of the situation in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, we lost this war. We lost it based upon the design, and we don't have the ability to redesign a conflict that we can compete against the Russians. They have the world's largest, most combat-hardened military that's out there. There's nothing that can stand toe-to-toe with them. The second most capable military is the Ukrainian military, and they're being slaughtered on the battlefield. No other military can survive against the Russians. I'll leave you with this. I keep saying I'll leave you at that, but then I get another thought. The Marine Corps, and I love the Marine Corps. They've just created what they call the Marine. Basically, it's a combat drone unit, and they've created this unit, and the idea is to bring the first-person FPV drones, the suicide drones, the attack drones, into Marine Corps combat capabilities, because this is the future of war. This is the future. Right. And so
it's the present. Look, how about this? It's the present of war in Ukraine. Those guys know how to fight it. It's the future of war for us because we're learning it. It's the present for those guys because they are masters of it because they got to fight it every day. I just put it a little different way.
No, but that's the truth. The Marine Corps is saying we can't survive on a battlefield if we don't have this capability. Because it is now not just a weapon, it's part of maneuver. If you don't have the ability to use drones as a weapon to suppress the enemy, to create opportunities for advance, to cover your advance, drones are a weapon system now. And if you don't know how to do it, if you go up against an enemy that does know how to do it, you're going to get wiped out. Look, the Ukrainians right now in certain areas on the battlefield have brought the Russians to a standstill. I saw this video. It was just, distressingly fascinating. You have a Russian tank advancing, and literally, as it's moving forward 100 meters, it gets hit 15 times by drones. As it moves, the Ukrainians just bring them up like a hornet's nest. Bam, 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 bam. And it doesn't matter how many nets you have on it. Eventually, bam, a chink in the armor, bam, immobilized, bam, dead. Everybody in that vehicle was killed. you have times on the battlefield now for the Russians to move forward and do their rotation or to bring in food and all that. The infantry literally has to crawl 1.5 kilometers and pray they don't get seen by the Ukrainian drones, because if the Ukrainian drones spot you, you're dead. That's just the reality of the war today. So this, I have to turn off your comments because not a fighter, is just a talker, not a fighter. Meet me anytime you want, bastard, and I'll knock the shit out of you. And I'm sorry, I turned it off, but I hate
the chat is.
So it's done.
I would say this. It's you know what I say about the chat. Well, the guys at Langley got to get paid too. You know what I mean? Let's not get mad at the guys.
The guys at Langley know that if they stood up with me, they'd die because they've tried it in the past. You know, I may be old, but I mean, it just pisses me off because they don't know what they're talking about. I don't like to say anything, but that's why my wife told me to turn them off a long time ago. I thought I'd monitor the pulse of the chat, but I saw that, and it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Just a talker, not a fighter. I'll show you what a talker can do. And
but you know what? So let me real quick. I'll tell you. See, here's what people always try to do with me. I guess I call them the agents or the bots. They always try to bring up the issue of race. Well, black people this or white people this, and I just say, yeah, whatever. I ain't talking about it. Right. I literally had a guy say, oh, yeah, black, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I don't want to talk about the race stuff. He goes, you're a race baiter. And I'm like, yeah, I still ain't talking about the race stuff. People are looking for points. And I feel like a lot of them are, let's face it, they pay a lot of people to be on these chats, to be on Facebook. A while back, it came back that the Pentagon had 50 or 60,000 people that they paid 60,000 just to be online doing that kind of crap day or night. And when I saw that the Gray Zone did, and when I saw that, I'm like, sons of bitches, I should have known. At that point, I decided they'll never get me. But anyway,
trying to drive a wedge between you and me. I mean, this past week, there's people out there, Garland and Scott, they hate each other, and Garland's doing this to Scott and Scott's doing this to Garland, and I'm like, what?
Sure, yeah, sure. Whatever makes
anything about Garland and I. Okay.
But that's the game out there, but at any rate, the other thing I wanted to say, because we got a couple more minutes, and I wanted to touch this. So here's what he says. In response, Carlson, this is the last part of what Tucker Carlson did that I don't want to miss. Carlson referenced a Pentagon assessment indicating that at one point, the risk of the Ukraine conflict escalating to nuclear war reached 50%, arguing that any policymaker comfortable with such odds belongs in prison for the Kremlin insane. And now apparently it's come out now. Pentagon said, imagine that. Imagine that, everybody who's out there in the chat, everybody when you go to the a convenience store on the corner, the 16-year-old kid that's working there selling you stuff, when you go to McDonald's, when you go to the car wash, somebody washing your car, when you call your aunt that you haven't talked in a long time, hey, Aunt so-and-so. These people had gotten to the point where everybody has a 50-50 chance of living. And they continued with that. Yeah. You're right. I'll put it like that. They say they should be in prison for the criminally insane. Because I am a person of somewhat integrity and somewhat reserved, I won't say what I think should have happened to them. But trust me, it ain't a prison for the criminally insane. But that people don't understand the level of danger these people play with, Scott.
There's a criminal charge, terroristic threats. And I'm not an expert on it, but I know people have been arrested for making terroristic threats. So if I go to the mall and stand up and, I'm going to shut this thing down and burn down that building, kill everybody inside, even though I don't have matches on me or anything, gasoline or nothing, I'm still going to be arrested for making terroristic threats. So now you have the government. And again, I think it's more than 50%, because let me tell you why.
Oh, yes.
In November, you had the man who wrote the war plan, the rear admiral who wrote the war plan, talk and say, we're We're ready to go to nuclear war with Russia. We're comfortable with that. We've come up with an exchange. An exchange is a new exchange of nuclear weapons that we feel we can prevail. We can win a nuclear war. And I'm like, you that's wrong. But I mean, that's you should be arrested for.
How about this? Theodore Apostle, one of the most accomplished scholars on earth on this particular subject, disagrees with you, and he's a physicist.
Yeah. Well, we can't win the war. But here's the other thing that happened, though, at that time, because that was in November. At that time, the New York Times and Washington Post were running around saying, and again, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, don't believe the New York Times and the Washington Post. Even if they tell the truth, it's because they're spinning something, because they probably previously lied. But the New York Times and Washington Post back then were saying that the CIA's assessment of Russia's new nuclear doctrine is that the Russians are bluffing. This is all a bluff. And therefore, we can take everything with a grain of salt because Russia will never take it to that level. But then I went and met with a very senior Democrat, not a Republican, a Democrat, because remember, in December, this is the time when Biden's still in office. And I said, I know you can't talk about classified things, and I'm not asking, but, what's your feeling about the Russians? Are they're bluffing and all this kind of stuff? And he said, Scott, that the New York Times got it wrong. He said, I was at that briefing. And what I can tell you is that the CIA said the Russians aren't bluffing. The exact opposite, that the Russians aren't bluffing. But he said, that's not the scary thing. The scary thing was that the senior Biden administration people present at the briefing went, that's okay. Neither are we. That's how close we came. So when you have an administration that says the Russians aren't bluffing, and they say, neither are we, at the same time, they're ordering the Ukrainians to fire long-range ATACMS missiles into Russia, knowing that crosses the red line set forth in Russia's new nuclear doctrine, therefore enabling Russia to use nuclear weapons in retaliation at a time when we have a war planner saying, we're ready for that. We're ready for the exchange. Guys, we were so close to everybody dying, because there's no, Garland, it's not 50% of the people dying. That's a 50% chance of a war that kills everybody. 100% of the people dying. And that was the insanity. Someday, maybe I'll write a book about what happened in November, how close we came. People keep talking about the missiles of October, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how people have made movies and written books, and, Oliver Stone and everybody else is out there. The most dangerous time in recent American history was November and December of last year, when the Biden administration recklessly put us on a path towards nuclear war with Russia, and everybody was just sleepwalking through it.
There was an article, literally, I couldn't believe it. I think it was in the Washington Post, and it was about if the Russians launched a nuclear attack on Kiev. And they're walking around talking to people, and the guy's like, well, I would first go to pick my daughter up from school. And then, I'm thinking, what the hell are they talking about? Literally, it was in the Washington Post. It was unbelievable. They're like, well, I would go pick my daughter up from school. I've got 2 daughters in school. And they were saying things like this. Well, I would, my wife has packed a backpack with sandwiches and drinks for the children, so that we would go to our aunt's house and hide in the basement. And I'm like, well, first of all, if we'll start here, you're just on the other side of the border from Russia, and it would take like 1.0 seconds for the, so I think I'll boom. But why would the Russians nuke something on their own border and they get the fall? But all of that, it was like this cartoonish discussion of nuclear war. Yeah. I felt like, and it was in the Washington Post, it wasn't what would the Kiev do, because they knew good and damn well that Russia wasn't going. It was propaganda to imply that a nuclear war was just a bad day, like a storm. Maybe floods, not quite as bad. You go pick your kids up, you call, you check with the kinder. Hey, how's things going? All right, hey, I'll pick my kids up for the nuclear war. They may be a little late tomorrow, but we'll see you tomorrow. And my wife's got some sandwiches and stuff, kind of like a picnic. Maybe we'll go down to beach for a while and come back after the nuclear war. You know, the absurdities that we saw. But when you look in history, this was around that time. Now, actually, this was like last spring, maybe. But basically, the bottom line was it was obvious that it was an unrealistic discussion of nuclear war. And I feel like it was designed to soften people's mind so they wouldn't be horrified of it. You know, JFK didn't at one time, I think they said that some of his generals said to him something like, yeah, we may lose the East Coast, but we'll win and we'll take the, and he was like, these freaking people are mad. They're insane. We may lose the East Coast. Hey, that's us. But they know the truth, Scott. It's madness here. Go ahead.
When JFK was first briefed on the what was called the Single Integrated Operation Plan, SIOP, America's first nuclear war plan, he was the first president to be briefed on it because it didn't exist prior to that. Until then, it was a series of unrelated miniature nuclear war plans. This one was the Single Integrated Operational Plan. He walked out and turned to, I think, his chief of staff or something. He says, and we call ourselves the human race. And just so people know, he rejected that plan. When he was briefed on it by the Pentagon, he said, no, I'm not going to be the guy that ends the world. You got to give me options other than just complete global termination. But yeah, no, it's crazy. You know, but here's the thing. You know, in Europe right now, you see Europe saying, Europeans need to prepare for 72 hours. You know, and they've got the water and the food. And they did this cute little video where the lady's like, and the radio and the spare batteries and the water and the this and the that. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And you say this article's talking about the person. Gone, this is why we're going to Hawaii. Because let me tell you what reality is. The reality will be the Hawaiian school teacher who says, I don't know what to do. My kids are in the classroom and the alarm's going off and we're going to die. I mean, the missiles coming in, there's nothing we can do. The people at home looking at their home saying, where do I go? Where do I go? What do I do? People running to shelters, the helplessness people feel. Because this was no longer a drill. This was no longer theoretical. They believed the missile was coming in and they had to sit there and go, it's over. There's nothing we can do. It's over. Every American needs to feel that. Every American needs to wake up one morning and get in a situation where they think it's over in the next 30 minutes. They're all going, and there's nothing you can do. There's nothing, literally nothing. You can't go pick up the kids. You can't do anything except sit there and die. That's what nuclear war is. That's the reality of nuclear war. There ain't no riding this out. I'm going to go in my bunker. I've got my 6 crates of, Chef Boyardee ravioli, and I've got 3 cases of water, and I got my gun. And I'm a survivalist. No, you're dead, just like everybody else. You can't survive a nuclear war. You can't. And the people who say they can are ignorant as the day is long, and they're dangerous because the concept of surviving a nuclear conflict feeds into the notion that you can survive a nuclear war, therefore you can fight a nuclear war. No, there can be no nuclear war ever.
And the dangerous part will be, and this is what I say, at some point, reality hits. At some point, you look at that chessboard and you say, any move I make is checkmate. I've lost. At some point, all the, we're ready to send troops from London and Paris, blah, 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 in a peace deal. At some point, you say, which we all know is a bluff. We all know they're not going to do it. They can't do it. They're just doing that to muck up the talks. You know what I mean? They're just doing that to muck up the talks, to send a message to screw up the talks. They can't do it. They'd be run out of their own country if they tried. But at some point, all of the bluster of how bad Russia is comes to a point that, holy crap, the lines have crumbled. The Ukrainian troops are surrounded everywhere. The ones that aren't surrounded are giving up or they're running. They're abandoning Kiev. The troops are abandoning their positions in the city. They're running for it. They're getting overrun. You know what I mean? At some point, you wake up and everything is gone to hell. And it is the Battle of Sepultiva, you know, or whatever, Sepultiva, whatever it was, where it's like the only thing you can do is fly to Moscow as quick as possible and make a deal. And guess what, Scott? They got a deal in 2014, 2015, whatever it is. This time, if they fly in, ain't no deal to be had. There's no deals. It's a, oh, you know, we just happen to have a document for you. It's called an unconditional surrender. There's no more deals, nothing to talk about. We don't even have terms written on the surrender. It's blank. Because we're going to do whatever the hell we want. We gave you a chance and you wouldn't listen. And now it's all ours. And you know what? If you want to come in and fight us and stop us, that's your only option. And that's what it's going to come down to from the looks of things.
You know, there's that movie Downfall. It's a great movie about the last days of Hitler, focusing on the bunker. And after Hitler commits suicide and, you know, power is transferred to Donetsk, etc., General Krebs was told, he was a senior German general commander of the Berlin garrison, was told to go in and negotiate a surrender with the Soviets. So Krebs walks out with his white flag, and General Chuikov is the one who receives him, I think, commander of the 62nd Army, I believe. And they were the ones who were in Stalingrad. They're the ones who held on to the West Bank of the Volga against all the odds and etc. He's the hero of Stalingrad, and he's, you know, hero that fought through. So he's there, and Krebs comes in, and Chuikov says, "Okay, I'll meet you. Sit down." And Krebs goes, "Well, I'd like to negotiate the terms of our surrender." And Chuikov said, "You don't seem to understand what's happening. There is no terms of your surrender. You have a choice to drop your weapons and live, or continue to fight and die. You don't have any say about anything else. We have total say. We decide what will happen to you. It's over. You lost. It's unconditional surrender, no negotiation." And Krebs went back, came back and went, "I guess it's whatever you want me to sign, I'm signing, because the war's over." And that's the reality of it. Yeah. Everybody's in there thinking, I mean, like Zelensky running around thinking that he has a vote, he has a say, he has anything. That's not the game that's being played, ladies and gentlemen. Zelensky and the European Union, and even to some extent the Trump administration, you're General Krebs. You don't have a choice. You're going to either sign the document the Russians give you to sign, or you're going to die. Because as Tucker Carlson said, we lost the war, and to the victor go the spoils. I mean, there are consequences for losing wars. This is why you shouldn't get involved in a war to begin with, because there are consequences to losing wars. And the consequence here is that we don't get a say on how it ends. Russia gets to dictate the terms.
And might I add this? When you do, and we'll end with this, when you embark in a full spectrum war against Russia, diplomatic, you're trying to isolate it. Economic, you're trying to economically crush them. Military, you're trying to use this proxy. You risk suffering a full spectrum defeat. Right now, the Russians, one of the things they're doing is, a lot of people haven't, I've been keeping up with this. They're helping the Sahel region rebuild their military. They're building something in Africa that's going to counter Africa, because they know sooner or later ECOWAS and the French will try to get their money, their power together and go back and maybe 5, 10, 20, whatever, and take all of that. Russia's building that. You know what I mean? China, Russia's going to put a base in Sudan. I don't know if you did that. So here's what's happening. You had a full spectrum war against them, which means you're suffering a catastrophic full spectrum defeat. And there's no way around it. At some point, you've lost. And it's not, it will be far worse after the loss, because after the loss, the global South, you know, particularly South America, Africa, you think they're going to be scared of the U.S.? Who do you think they're all going to side with? Everybody's going to look at the U.S. and they're looking at Putin, and they're all going to say, man, that guy kicked your ass and sent you home, and you get no respect. whatsoever. You know what I'm saying? Those people are going to be like, you get no respect, man. You came at him. You came to his doorstep. He asked you to leave him alone. You wouldn't do it. And he kicked your ass. The humiliation of losing a war when you choose to go after, and you're a world power, and you choose a full spectrum proxy war against another world power, and you lose, they're the king of the hill after that. You know what I mean, Scott?
Yeah, it's a dangerous world we live in. And we played high stakes poker and we lost. We lost the game. I continue to advise people. Again, I'm going to piss off your chat, but I don't care. Just I caution people to understand. People are like, America's the Houthi, and I learned it's the Houthi, not the Houthi, are kicking America.
Houthi was with the blowfish.
He was the Houthi and the blowfish. That's right. They're kicking Ansarallah's kicking America's butt. Just want to remind people of the following. We've deployed hundreds of bombers and thousands of fighters, thousands of miles from our shore in a sustainable fashion. We have 2 carrier battle groups and a 3rd one coming in. No other military in the world today can project power the way we do. I just want to remind people that we haven't been beaten. Okay, we lose conflicts because we don't commit. We've not lost a conflict where we've said this is existential in nature and we're committing the whole power of the United States into this conflict. We've always gone in with a little toe here or use a proxy here, and then we get beat and we pull our little toe out. Somebody was lecturing, America got wiped out in Vietnam and got wiped out in Afghanistan, and they'll get wiped out again in Yemen. We withdrew from Vietnam and didn't even look back. That was it. The end of the Vietnam War was like, oops, okay, let's get on. We're moving on. Meanwhile, Vietnam lost millions of dead and was a wreck of a nation. Is that victory? Afghanistan. We withdrew from Afghanistan. Oh, yeah, you got your made-for-TV moment, the airplane taking off and General Donahue coming on and all that. How many Americans lost sleep the next day? We just woke up and went on with our business because Afghanistan meant nothing to us. Literally nothing. We walked away from it. Meanwhile, millions of Afghans had died and their country is a wreck. And so people who say America got beat, we didn't get beat. We didn't engage. Had we engaged, there wouldn't be a Vietnam. Had we engaged, there wouldn't be an Afghanistan. And that's the difference. You see, because if we decide to engage with Iran existentially, Iran will not exist when this is done. Because we can project power like nobody can project power in the world. We just don't commit to these fights. That's half of America's problems. Because as you said, if you're going to get in the fight and then you lose the fight, you end up looking pretty stupid. Then people have a perception of weakness. And then that perception becomes reality because perception creates its own reality. But I just want to caution people into thinking that America's this defeated nation that's going away and the wind blows and we're gone. It's not that way at all. We just haven't committed existentially. And with Iran, I'm afraid that we are committing existentially. And this is why it's so important that we don't get into one of these emotionally charged, America get their bats, all the Iranians have to do is stand up to America. There was and this, Garland, because you've studied history. There was a moment in time where America was talking about dropping nuclear weapons on North Vietnam. Where because of
and
the
China and China.
Yeah. There was a moment in time where we were having that discussion. Is this an existential fight? Is this the we win this thing or we die fight?
Oh, how about this? There was a guy that ran for president in '64 that advocated for it. Goldwater advocated for that as part of his platform.
And I can guarantee you this, ladies and gentlemen, had we used nuclear weapons against Vietnam, we wouldn't have lost that war. All right. We wouldn't have won it because morally we become this horrible nation that uses nuclear weapons and all that stuff.
And who knows? And that's the other part of it. The other part of it is this. You don't know what's going to happen when you get to a conflict. One thing about starting a war, and people, and that's the thing that the Americans and the Europeans will never get. You know what I mean? If you light a fire and a spark starts, oh, I'm just going to burn a little bit in my yard. And next thing you know, some leaves blow up into the woods next door. And next thing you know, you've just burned down Pacific Palisades. Starting those conflicts, there's no way to know how far it's going to go. These lunatics that think they can contain a war, you know what I mean? That's the dangerous part about it.
Europe should know that lesson, because twice in the last century they got burned by the fires that they themselves started.
Exactly. Well, America, these idiots haven't learned from the things they're saying these days.
America, we're a nation of naive idiots, because we've, like I said, we've gotten in these the only, World War II wasn't even existential in nature. Let's be honest about that. The Japanese never threatened the American homeland. Germany never threatened the American homeland. We were always fighting over there. And the worst thing that happened here at home is we had to tighten our belt a little bit, because, we needed to turn in our pots for the soldiers and buy less gas. That was the war to us. Compare and contrast that to the Soviet Union, that had 30% of their country razed to the frickin' ground. 27 million people killed. Look at Europe, razed to the ground, destroyed, major cities taken down, centuries-old cultural monuments crushed by the devastation of war. America, we've never experienced that.
Oh, can I remind you of something? And that is that at the beginning of this conflict, if you remember this, one of the things that Sergei Lavrov said was, America is accustomed to not getting hit, but if there's a conflict with Russia this time, the American homeland will get hit. You know what I mean?
So the American people know. Anatoly Antonov made that phone call in September. Biden was getting ready to sign off on, remember, Keir Starmer came in with the document to launch, and Anatoly Antonov, he hasn't talked about the details, but he had that conversation where he said, if you do this, there will be a nuclear war, and Washington, D.C. will be the target. And that's when suddenly the word got back to Biden, and he didn't sign the document. Now, that's the reality, ladies and gentlemen, is we're playing a game right now with Russia that if we do this stupidity, we cease to exist. The war planner I talked about, the rear admiral who briefed it to a DC think tank, one thing he did say in the question and answer period is, we talk about an exchange that we can win, but we probably haven't been honest to the American people about what winning means. Because winning means life as you know it never exists again. Whatever you call the American way of life, whatever you think this is, will never exist again. Your life will fundamentally change, and it won't be for the better. And he said, we probably have a responsibility to be honest with the American people about what we're getting into, but they'll never do that, Garland. Because once the American people understand that these guys are out there and they're threatening to end your life, everything you've worked for in your life to do, to have a family, to raise children, to buy a house, buy a car, go on vacations, what you've built your life to be and what your community is, will end. Will all end. It'll all be redefined by death, destruction, disease, everything. The whole world ends. And that's the fact. We don't win these things. We lose. Everybody loses. So this is why I say we have to be honest about the threats that are out there so that we understand the scope and scale of the consequences of going to war, for instance, in Iran. And then we have to advocate for peace. We have an absolute duty and responsibility to advocate for peace, for a negotiated settlement. All those people out there are saying that Iran needs to build a nuclear bomb. Go to hell.
Well, you know the big problem with that, and the Russians know that. Here's the problem with that. Here's the big problem with that. I've read a lot about that. The Saudis already have a deal with Pakistan. They got to get what UAE will get. It's not just about Iran having a nuclear, and that's why Russia's like really doing everything they can, saying we don't want Iran, because the UAE gets it, Saudi gets it. Before you know it, everybody around has a nuclear bomb. And one of those countries, just one, look at who's in charge of Syria right now. ISIS. Just one of those countries gets overtaken, the government overthrown by one of these lunatics, they're pushing a button. And once those missiles start flying, we're all going to die.
The Russia House this week is publishing an interview I did with Alexander Artamonov. He's a professor at the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Russian Foreign Affairs. He's a military and international affairs expert, runs the Department of International and National Security. And we talked about this, about nuclear nonproliferation. And what he said is that the Russians, the reason why the Russians are drawing a red line, and a lot of people don't know that, there was just negotiations, trilateral negotiations between the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians about the Iranian nuclear program. And while Russia, of course, is against an American military action, Russia has told the Iranians, you can't have a bomb. You can't have a bomb. And the reason why, what Professor Artamonov said, is that just what you said, Garland, once you get the proliferation of it, it's there. And then what he said is, not only is there a chance for accidental use, he said the use of tactical nuclear weapons will become the dominant way of ending conflicts, and that we will be condemned for a century of continuous tactical nuclear warfare. And the Russians said that's the reality we fear the most, because what will happen is in Europe, there will be a nuclear war. It won't be the global ending exchange, but it'll be Russia saying, we're done with this, nuke Kiev. And then someone will say, well, nuke Minsk. And then, then they'll stop it. And then later on they'll come up, well, nuke this, nuke that. And it'll be this proliferation of things. This is why for the people who are like, let Iran get the nuclear weapon. No.
It's not about it. It's not just about Iran. I think it was Alistair Crook was saying that I think the Saudis already have a deal with Pakistan. I'm not sure. It might have been Alistair Crook that if Iran gets if nuclear that the minute they do, the Saudis got one. Which there's a nasty, crazy element in Saudi Arabia. If they ever get in power, they're pushing the damn button. The Wahhabis. The UAE is going to immediately say, well, we got to have one. And here's the thing. Even these little teeny countries the size of with the size of Houston, they got enough money to buy it.
To buy it.
And now there's countries with 300,000 people with a nuke. And before Saudis, you know it, somebody gets pissed. Boink. Wham, 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 wham.
Back in the 80s, did this thing called Operation Eastern Wind, and they acquired from the Chinese a liquid fuel intermediate range missile, which is almost exclusively nuclear capable, but they put conventional warheads on some of them. The reason why this comes into play is during the lead up to the Gulf War, we were planning the initial strike on Iraq, and because the Iraqis had Scud missiles and it was believed they were going to fire some, we wanted the Saudis to fire their missiles in at the Iraqi Scud place. So we wanted them to fire their CSS-2s or whatever they were into Iraq. And it was all part of the plan, because I remember looking at opening up the battle plan when it was clear we're going to war, and looking at the first strike, because I was the Scud battle damage assessment officer. So I'm supposed to look at the targets and what munitions are going to be used on the targets so that I can evaluate whether or not the objectives were met or whether we have to restrike. And so I'm going, holy cow, we're going to be hitting these places with Chinese missiles, Saudi, China. So I'm like, that's cool. I've never seen that before. Let's wait for it to happen. At the last moment, the Saudis withdrew, and I remember that was led to some intense discussion between General Schwarzkopf and Prince Khalid, who was the Saudi guy. The reason why the Saudis withdrew is they had a secret deal with the Pakistanis that these missiles weren't meant to be used against Iraq. These missiles were the strategic deterrence against Israel. And if the Israelis ever got out of hand, these missiles, the warhead on it is compatible with a Pakistani design, and it can be immediately swapped out. And if people don't understand, the Saudi-Pakistani linkage is strategic in nature. The Pakistanis routinely provide tens of thousands of Pakistani soldiers who fight in the Saudi army. Indeed, the Saudi army that was fighting in the Gulf War was largely Pakistani. So was the Qatar army. So was the UAE army. All non-Arabs were out there doing the fighting. But the Pakistanis have had this agreement with the Saudis since the 1980s to provide this capability. I know that the Pakistani weapon didn't manifest itself until later, but the Pakistanis were always thinking about in this direction. This is why the Iraqis were, trying to buy, from AQ Khan, centrifuge up in the 80s. Yeah. So this was always part of it. And that's the reality today, that the Saudis have a ballistic missile force that is buried in silos. And that force isn't there to intimidate Iran or anything else. That is a force against Israel, but it can be used against Iran if Iran develops a nuclear weapon. And what will happen is the Pakistanis will immediately provide warheads for these missiles. And now,
everybody's locked and loaded and cocked and pointed at each other in the region. Everybody. And now what happens? For instance, Turkey. Turkey's very unstable right now. People are in the street, and the people in Turkey are very, very mad at Israel. Well, what happens if Turkey's loaded now with nukes and somebody overthrows Erdogan? Screw this. Boom. And now then Israel fires. So you would go from, it isn't even really about Iran with nukes. It's about the tip of the iceberg that everybody in the community says, all right, we're good. But if they get them, I want them. And they get them. Everybody gets them. Everybody's pointing at each other, and you're sitting there playing Russian roulette, knowing that at some point somebody is going to either act or say, "Well, this guy's going to act, so I better act." But Yemen will nuke Sana'a because they might. We're Saudi. Oh, wait a minute, the Israelis did this, and there was some attempts on the lives of the Saudi. That wasn't highly publicized, but in like a year or two ago, there was an attempt to overthrow the Saudi government. So what happens if one of these governments gets overthrown by one of these unstable groups? And soon as they get in power, the first thing they yell is Allahu Akbar, boink, and pushes the button, and everything goes to hell.
That's real.
That's reality.
Yeah, it's a real threat. Here's. Let me give you a scenario. And this is for the Iranians to listen, please, because there's a lot of hothead Iranians out there. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. We're going to do this. Maybe there's consequences for your actions. The Iranians are saying they're going to burn down Saudi oil fields. And they have the ability to do that. They have the ability to strike the Saudi oil fields and burn. They've proven that. The Yemeni launched strikes against in 2019. They've proven they can do that. So now you're Saudi Arabia. And you got the nuclear weapon now, but you're the Al Saud family, and you're in charge, and you're the rational players. You're the ones that have the hotels in London, and you fly there, and you take off your Arab clothes, and you dance and party in London. Then you come back and be pious. You're the good guys. And then you get into a spat where the United States gets into a spat, and you provide refueling aircraft or something, or you provide access, and either the Yemenis or the Iranians take out your oil fields. Now your economy collapses. And now what happens to the Al Saud family? Their heads,
they fall.
Their bodies.
They fall.
They either fly to London or they lose their heads. And now the Wahhabis are in charge. And these are the crazies. And now they have nuclear weapons. And now they go, Allah, as you said, Allah Akbar.
Boy.
Operation Boom, take out Israel, take out Tehran, take out Turkey, take out everybody we can, because God is our messenger, and we will die and go to heaven, and 72 virgins will make our life wonderful. And that's why Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, ladies and gentlemen, because it isn't a solution to anything. It's a solution.
It's the beginning of the end.
That's right.
And I think that's by the Russians.
Support the negotiations. Stop promoting an outcome that will only lead to the death of everybody in the region.
Yeah.
And it's not about, and again, I'll leave this last thought. Stop talking about Iranian pride, please. First of all, if you're not an Iranian, shut up. I don't want to hear it. The only ones who have a vote are the Iranians. Now, let me tell the Iranians about your history. You guys fought a war against Iraq, and a very long war, 8-year war, lost a lot of guys. And in the end, even though leading up to that, Khomeini said, I will never surrender. I will never yield. This is existential. Saddam's going down. That dirty dog, that man who invaded our territory, we're taking him down. And then they hit your cities with 189 Scud missiles in the spring of 1988. And the Ayatollah Khomeini said, we need peace. I will drink this cup of poison because it's the only option we have. Anything else is the death of our people, the death of our nation. Guys, your leadership is going to drink the cup of poison because they don't want to die. They don't want to sacrifice your people. And this should be celebrated.
I would say this, and I would say
promoting
this, look,
war.
There's no way to know what's going to happen. There's no way to know for sure. But here's what I would say. Right now, even Iran is an integral part of BRICS. It's an integral part of BRICS, and it's on the verge of blossoming economically as a part of the Silk Road, as a part of BRICS. You know what I'm saying? It's on the verge right there of really economic explosion as the world changes, as these tariffs things happen. I think the tariffs make BRICS a more attractive option, right? And right now, Russia and China are both saying you're sitting in just the right place. We need you geographically, right? You got all the stuff, you got gas, you got oil, everything is set just beautifully for Iran. The one thing that could screw it up is a war and boom. And I don't care what you think, win, lose, draw, pride, whatever. At that point, you go from being on the edge of really blossoming to some horrific war, and you're 100 years recovering from it if you ever recover. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. I'm with you. People get mad when you say this. To me, I'm not saying this is, to me, what I'm saying is not anti-Iran. It's pro-Iran.
Pro-Iran.
Iran is, and since I'm a person who, people know me, I'm a very pro-Russia person, right? Russia right now, their best interest right now is to keep Iran strong and to keep their alliance with Iran and to keep Iran out of a fight. If you want to take out BRICS or take out the Silk Road, just draw Iran into a war and bash it to pieces. And like I said, again, it doesn't matter, win, lose, or draw. You bring it into a war, you bash it to pieces, you get involved in a war, and you screw BRICS royally, and you screw the Silk Road royally. So
the Russians are already upset with Iran a little bit. I'll tell you why. Yeah. Because the BRICS entree was done by Raisi and his foreign minister. They did all the hard work, and they died in May. June was the big ministerial, and the Iranians couldn't represent because they had elections in June. And so by the time their new president and new foreign minister were appointed, they didn't have an adequate strategy. So they rolled into Kazan in October, not fully committed. They were playing games. Peskishkin was saying, we want to negotiate with the West. We don't know. We want to do this whole BRICS thing and all that. And the Russians are a little frustrated by that. They're like, hey, we need you to commit. And they need them to commit for instance, for that railroad that's going to go from St. Petersburg all the way down to
that's a way of what they're creating is alternative options to move goods from Russia and China, etc. And Iran is critical to that.
Absolutely critical to it. And
keeping Iran out of a war is critical because if nothing else, the anti-BRICS people would love to see in a war in Iran simply to take BRICS out. I mean, you could argue it's a war on BRICS and that the BRICS leaders need not to have a war on BRICS, that would set BRICS back 5 to 10 years. They have to come up with a full alternate plan for BRICS.
This is what the Chinese and the Russians were telling the Iranians in their most recent meeting. And it's what they told them before. They said, of course, we don't support what America's doing. We don't support a war. But the Russians made it clear, we ain't coming to your rescue. We're not going to war for you. What we're willing to do is create the conditions so that if you prevent a war, we can help you thrive economically. We can help you thrive, geopolitically. We can open up Central Asia to you. We can open up the Eurasian Economic Union to you. We can bring down this trade. We can do this whole stuff. The world is your oyster, but you have to be alive to exploit it. And you are going up against a country that's governed by an insane man who's willing to use nuclear weapons to bring your nuclear program down. And Don't do
And you
that.
know the other thing, and a country that's unstable and getting weaker. So if you look at a Russia and a China, and really in Iran, these countries think in terms of hundreds of years, of 50, 100
Well,
years.
China thinks in terms of hundreds of years. Russia might think
Yeah,
in terms of 10 years.
yeah. But my point being, if they can ride this thing out, the U.S. is the one that's getting weaker. You know what I mean? It's like, look, I don't have to fight you. You're getting weaker, and I'm getting stronger. And that if they can find a way to ride.
I wouldn't say America's getting weaker. What I would say is America's transitioning from being a global hegemon to being one of many in a multipolar world.
It's well, that's what I mean when I say it's not running things anymore. So it doesn't have the dominant power, and it's unstable.
It can't dictate outcomes. Yeah,
exactly. It's unstable. So the thing that is important, when we talk about the Iran conflict, here's my concern as an anti-war. First of all, as an anti-war person, first and foremost, don't get any wars started. Do what you have to do. I'm anti-war fundamentally. Don't talk big. Don't try to draw. I want these people to fight. You're not in Tehran. You're not in another country. The bombs won't be falling on you. You won't be like we talked about winning. Oh, we can win a nuclear war. Well, you didn't win if you're one of the people dead. Oh, we've got to stand up to no. First and foremost, it is critical to prevent this conflict. It's not about what Garland Nixon or Scott Ritter thinks. It's about saying this conflict has to be prevented. Prevent it now, prevent it today. We can work on something else next month, next week, things change. But it has to be prevented. And getting mad at me or Scott who say, whatever you disagree with us on, the foundation, I think, of what both of us are saying is this thing has to be prevented at all costs. I think that's 100%. That's the foundation of it. And people can get mad at me for whatever they want and say, oh, well, what's with you or what's with Scott? I will never get mad at somebody. Even if the devil himself landed in front of me and said, well, Garland, I think I want to prevent the war. I'd say, okay, that's it. That's okay. I wouldn't trust them, but I just say, so, people I don't understand all the people that get flipped out over this.
What I like, they say we pivoted. Garland and Scott, you've pivoted. You've pivoted away from what?
I'm consistent.
We were anti-war back then, and we're anti-war now. We're not pivoting away. We're adjusting to the reality so that the outcome is no war.
Well, how about this? One of my things, for obvious reason, is I want to see, my background is, of course, African. I want to see the African country Africa who has been, down for so long. And now I see some opportunities for economics and alliances with Russia and China. I think that's great. I'd like to see Africa have the opportunity to flourish economically. And BRICS is presenting that opportunity.
Yep.
And Iran is an integral part of BRICS. And if Iran falls and goes into war and becomes unstable or whatever happens, BRICS is set back for the next 10 years. At a time when Russia's like making a move right now. All right, we're going to help the Sahel region defend themselves. And they're making deals and all that. So to me, part of this, a lot of people talk about, it's an attack on BRICS. It is a devastating attack on BRICS. So if you are supporting the global South, you don't want this to happen because it slows the hell out of BRICS. It takes one of the pillars of BRICS down. Again, what do they need? They need oil. They need gas. They need things that that Iran provides. And guess what? You go through Iran to get to Africa. You know what I mean? From Russia and China, that's a back way to get in and out of Africa to move goods. So my point being, people have to wake up to realize that the discussion always has to be about stopping the war. Yeah. I don't care who it is. That has to be the foundation of every discussion. And if somebody gets mad at me, I can give a shit less. We can disagree on a lot of things, but I'm never going to take a position that says people should fight.
Start loving the Iranians more than you hate America.
How about that?
How about that? Start loving the Iranians more than you hate America. Because all this stuff's out there. I hate America. America needs to die. The hell with imperialism. Wonderful. You guys are great. How about saying, I don't want Iranians to die? How about saying that I'd like the Islamic Republic to survive? I'd like Iran to become economically thriving through the BRICS process. Start falling in love with Iran. Start caring about the Iranians more than you hate America.
That's right.
America's going to be here for a while. You can kick us. It's going to take a while for the empire to fall. So you got a long time to kick America. But how about loving the Iranians more than you hate America?
How about that, Scott? How about that? All right, thanks a lot. Before we go, everybody remember one more thing that is critical, and write down the line. And there we go. Scott has a new book, and it's called Highway to Hell, the Armageddon Chronicles 2015 to 2024. And you know what? You're looking right there on Amazon. You can grab it anytime you want. And of course, go to scottritter.com for all the information about all the good anti-war work that Scott's doing. We're out.
Subscribe to the Russia House.
Oh yeah, subscribe to the Russia House. We forgot about that. Share this on all your social media platforms so they can all chatter about it. What the hell's going on with that Carlson, Nixon, and Scott Ritter? We're out.